this talk I'm going to give tonight, it's about the future, not just of the Republican Party, it's the future of the American character. It's a conversation about what we're really fighting for. The policies that we're fighting for, which are downstream of the politics, which are downstream of the culture. It's the reason we gather here. The reason we come together under the name of President Lincoln is to remind ourselves of the American character, the American ethos. It's the driving force behind the great American experiment that has created more prosperity and freedom than any other endeavor in human history. We gather here because we're grateful. We're grateful for a country that has enshrined and protected our God-given rights into a governing system and cherished those timeless principles of limited government, liberty, sovereignty of the individual and country, protection of property rights, and the notion that God is the ultimate moral authority. We gather here because we have to. Because these principles, once labeled liberal principles, are now exclusively conservative, and they're under attack. They're under attack from an increasingly radical form of leftism, the ideology of progressivism. Progressivism. It's a seemingly innocuous term. It implies progress. Progress towards good things. What kind of good things, you might ask? Well, whatever those who use the term deem good things to be. And herein lies the danger we face. Progressivism is radical change for the sake of change itself. It is a belief that human nature can be transformed and controlled by government, that the sovereignty of the individual can and should be subsumed by the collective will, resulting in a utopian model and the vision of the progressive elite. And we put that more simply, it's the pursuit of power under the guise of well-intentioned progress. The problem here is that there is no foreseeable limit to such a progress and no basis upon which to judge whether that progress is inherently good, because there is no foundational principle guiding such radical change. When one change happens, even a good one, such as women's suffrage, the progressive must then find a new crisis from which to build their utopia and pursue power. This isn't an ideology, but a strategy to obtain power. In the Wilsonian era, progressivism used fascism and nationalism to increase their grip on power. In the Obama era, we were told that progressivism was about pragmatism and unity. No red states, no blue states. And when this turned out to be false, the American people responded by delivering the elections to the Republican Party. To get that power back, the modern progressive relies on the intersectional coalition. This idea that unrelated groups are strung together by their collective fight against a perceived injustice. They convince groups of their oppression and further convince them that the progressive is the champion of the oppressed. They use identity politics to divide people and victim hierarchies to silence arguments against them. Because if you aren't a victim, then you have no right to an opinion, and so it goes. But notice I do not use the term liberal. I purposefully choose my words carefully here because I don't see anything inherently malicious in liberalism, even in the modern form. But the truth is that well-intentioned liberals, concerned with wealth inequality or the environment or the rights of the most vulnerable in our society, they are used maliciously by the progressive movement. The liberal wish list is used as a gateway. It's an excuse by the progressive to open Pandora's box and pursue power at all costs. Progressivism leads to an ever-increasing government control over our lives and removal of our freedoms. And unfortunately, it's also the natural and inevitable result of liberalism, because liberalism gives progressives the moral excuses they need to take action and pursue power at all costs. This inevitable slippery slope is always and has always been apparent to the conservative. We have always sensed that the well-intentioned arguments of liberals would lead to something darker, even if it's not what liberals originally intended. Because once you start to undermine basic foundational principles, even with the best of intentions, the spiral downward can't be stopped, or at least it can't be slowed. And it's for this reason that conservatives fight so hard to preserve first principles and the tried and true traditions. It is why we care so deeply about the ideals and principles that our country was founded on and why we must fight so hard to protect them. Policy comes from our politics. Politics is downstream of culture. And because the liberal narrative is primarily about feeling morally good and kind and caring, it results in policies that feel good to champion but don't actually do good. Again, this doesn't make them bad people. And we can't demonize them as such, but it does make their policies difficult to take seriously. Opening our borders to the world, for example, it may make some people feel good and charitable in the short term, but it's not sustainable. Over 400,000 apprehensions on the border just last year is not sustainable, either for law enforcement, our courts, our civic institutions, or our cultural fabric. Taxing the rich may make some people feel good, but it does nothing to help the poor. A strong free market economy, more jobs with a tight labor market, and reducing burdensome occupational licensing does help the poor. Handing out more health care coverage may feel good, but it does nothing to improve access when record numbers of doctors refuse to work in an overburdened system, and our taxes are tripled to pay for it. Trumpeting radical environmentalism like the Green New Deal may make some people feel good and righteous, but it ends up creating massive energy poverty, where the poor are hurt the most and our industries fail and our electric bills skyrocket, all while CO2 emissions barely budge and the temperature, by their own data, decreases by 0.015 degrees Celsius. But we sure do feel good. And claiming to be for women's reproductive freedom, it may feel good. It may feel like liberal empathy for women's choice. But in reality, it's a path to devaluing human life, and it results in the radical pro-abortion laws like we recently saw in New York. We can't just point out the faults in the progressive movement. We have to remind people of the good American principles that served our country so well, the principles that drive our ethos and create the American character. This is the part where I say the oft-repeated quote by Ronald Reagan: "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction." Yeah, it's overused, but for good reason. It's true, and it's timeless. The American founding is not necessarily encoded into our DNA. What is in our DNA is actually all of those countercultural principles that I mentioned: tribalism, identity politics, an emphasis on feelings and instincts instead of individual freedom. For us to effectively defend the cultural foundations that made our country so great, we have to tell people what they are. And more crucially, we've got to show them why they're so vitally important. Because these points that I'm about to tell you, they're about the American character, our culture. And as we know, I'm going to say it again, politics is downstream of culture. And for us to get the right policies, we've got to get the right politics. We have to start with the culture if we're ever going to get to the policy. So here's some ideas about what I think the American character is about. Number one, the American character is about personal responsibility. And you've heard that before. But we don't always make the argument for why it's important. It's important because it's the only human attribute that can lead to self-empowerment. To be empowered is arguably the most crucial pillar of human success. And it is solely derived from a sense of responsibility, a sense that you are responsible for your actions and that you succeed based on your merits. According to Pew Research, European countries like Germany, 69% believe success or failure is determined by forces outside their control. 70%, practically 70% of their people are disempowered. In America, only 43% believe that. I wonder how many in this room believe that. Probably a lot less. Believing that your success is outside your control is an enormous problem. When people stop believing they're in charge of their own destiny, they become disempowered. When you are disempowered, you lose all incentive to work, improve, and contribute. Why does this matter? It's a question of sustainability. If more and more people stop taking responsibility, eventually we run out of people to pick up the slack. If you have a world of individuals always waiting for help, demanding assistance, well, what does that do to society? It's an unsustainable cultural trend. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean exclusively the pull yourself up by your bootstraps individualism that we're often accused of. It's a logical place for safety nets. But it's a recognition that our culture must be founded on the idea that our first instinct must be personal empowerment. Responsibility is empowerment, and empowerment leads to human achievement. Number 2, American character is mentally tough. A culture of mental toughness and grit pervades America, or at least it used to. We're a pioneering people. We pride ourselves on adapting to adversity, overcoming the odds, and achieving the impossible, or again, at least we used to. So how do we get that sense of grit back? More importantly, how do we make mental toughness a virtue again? Being mentally tough is about the stories we tell ourselves. Do the injustices that we face, do they make us crumble, or do they harden our resolve? Do we tell stories of victimhood, or how unfair life is, or how the system is rigged against us? Or do we tell a story of facing adversity and then overcoming it? But mental toughness also means discipline. A culture that exhibits discipline and self-control is a culture that thrives. Are you able to avoid overindulgence and save your money for rent instead of recreation? Can you balance work and play? Can you buckle down, delay gratification, and exhibit self-control in order to achieve your goals? A society can only withstand so many individuals who are overly indulgent, undisciplined, and reckless. The more of those we get, the more mentally tough and disciplined the rest of us have to be. And this inevitably leads to resentment, and a resentful culture is unsustainable. Number 3, Americans have a sense of duty. And by this I mean there's a sense of loyalty to our own country, and specifically our country's founding ideals. In other words, it's patriotism. We have an identity as a country. We strive to be connected by a certain set of ideals based on the founding documents and embodied by the American flag, the national anthem, and the Pledge of Allegiance. Notice I didn't say skin color or heritage or religion or socioeconomic status. I said ideals, because the only colors that matter are the red, white, and blue. And if you lose sight of these founding ideals, then you're only connected by the fact that we happen to live in the same geographical area. This is the meaning of a pluribus unum, of many one, and it is the opposite of identity-driven politics. It's the opposite of tribalism and multiculturalism. When this sense of loyalty to the things that bring us together is eroded, then the American spirit itself is eroded. Number 4. There's only 5. Just bear with me. And then I got more to talk about. The American character is virtuous. We are charitable. We are moral. We show respect and kindness. We are grateful for the Judeo-Christian history that provides us with our set of morals. And this is important, to recognize where our morality comes from and why it can't be changed or traded away. Okay, you can talk. Because even if you don't believe in God, it's undeniable that our morality is derived from Judeo-Christian tradition and history. But we do need God to explain our morality. God is absolute, and therefore our morality is absolute. If there is no God, then our morality can be changed according to human preference. And if morality can be changed according to human preference, as it often is in secular societies, then the human mind can justify anything, from the horrors of the Holocaust to the debilitating impact of communism. Secularism is not sustainable. So we strive to be morally good and kind and fair and charitable. We are not charitable with other people's money, as a socialist would be. We are charitable in our own hearts, with our own resources. We as Americans are more likely to give to charity than any other country. Deep down, we know that if we aren't willing to help our own neighbor and instead rely on the government to do it, then we have a society in decay. And again, a society that cannot possibly last. Number 5, American character is about liberty. It's about individual freedom and the ability to self-govern. I don't think I need to expand on liberty for y'all, but I do believe it's worth pointing out that you can't have freedom without all of the other values I just listed, firmly woven into the cultural narratives that we tell ourselves. If you're not personally responsible, then you're not empowered. If you're not empowered, then you can't possibly be mentally tough. And if you're not mentally tough, you can't possibly survive in a competitive, free society. And if you're not personally responsible, then by definition, you believe others should be responsible for you, thus infringing on their freedoms, so say goodbye to liberty. And if you can't take personal responsibility, then it is highly unlikely that you would take responsibility for the country or feel any sense of duty towards that country, so say goodbye to another foundational bedrock, loyalty to the place you're from. And finally, if we're not a moral people with concrete, unchangeable virtues, then how on earth can we be trusted with freedom? All of these elements build on one another. They're all required. There might be more. This is just what I thought of, but it's a good start. You know. And these values aren't new to you. And frankly, most people live by these values, conservatives, liberals alike. But the question is, are we reinforcing them enough? Are we making the case for how important these values actually are? The best and simplest reason for why we need these values is this: it builds a sustainable, enduring society. Sustainability of our society should be our strongest argument for why the conservative cultural perspective is the right one. We are the ones that prioritize our most important cultural principles, which means that it is conservatives who fight for the sustainable society. Liberals don't want to defend the values they themselves live by, and leftists want to totally destroy them. Conservatives are the only hope for ensuring that we live in a free and prosperous America that can be passed on for many generations to come. The liberals have their part too. They remind us to take on some of the harsher elements of our free society. They correct injustices and attempt to smooth out the rougher edges of the market. Now, they often go too far, as we know. But the conversation between a conservative that wants to protect the sanctity of the free market and a liberal that wants higher wages for workers, at least that's within the realm of reasonable debate. But the progressive, unlike the well-intentioned liberal, wants much more than that. Wants much more than just to feel good about their moral superiority. They want revolution. They want power. They're enamored by the language of resistance, the romantic ideal of throwing it all away and starting over in some glorious Marxist revolution. They know exactly what our foundational narratives are, possibly better than we do, and they are relentlessly trying to replace them with Marxist ideology. We have to fight this. We must remind Americans that the countercultural values of the left can only exist as a weight on the back of traditional values. Taking responsibility for others, as the socialists once, can only occur on the backs of people who first take responsibility for themselves. A responsible government doesn't just mean responsible spending. It means a government that is based upon the right foundational principles. A people that can take responsibility and overcome adversity, embrace freedom and self-governance, treat each other with respect and decency, and agree on a basic set of ideals that brings us together. Again, this has real policy implications. Remember, politics is downstream of culture, and policy is derived from politics. So it is vital that we explain that our policies have deep and important cultural foundations backing them up. We have to get the culture right, because if we screw up the cultural principles, you can rest assured that we will end up with pretty undesirable policies. Let's give you some examples. We believe in loyalty to our country, and we therefore believe in securing our borders and protecting our sovereignty. If you don't subscribe to any sense of loyalty to your country or the rule of law that keeps it in order, then an open border policy starts to sound pretty good. After all, why bother to protect the physical borders of a country you don't even believe in? If personal responsibility, mental toughness, and liberty are not important founding cultural principles, then attacks on the free market itself can be justified. Never mind that the free market, individual liberty, and property rights are responsible for ending thousands of years of human poverty and hardship. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel equitable. Policies of wealth redistribution become easier to justify because taxing the rich makes the progressive feel good and moral and fair. But a responsible, disciplined, mentally tough citizenry can compete in a free market. In fact, desires to compete in a free market. And in fact, it is only the free market that has been the system that brings billions out of poverty and into prosperity. And again, if you don't believe in personal responsibility or discipline or freedom, then it's also easy to justify larger and larger entitlement programs that will bankrupt my generation. But if we properly ingrain a sense of personal responsibility into our citizens, then they are less likely to be bought off by the promise of more government programs, less likely to be bribed into submission. These cultural foundations matter. They are the basis for every conservative policy prescription we have. And more than that, they're also the foundations on which our Constitution is built. The strength of our constitutional republic is not only protection of our inalienable rights, but the transfer of power down to the local and state level. This is the essence of limited government and federalism. And Reagan said in his first inaugural address, the federal government did not create the states. The states created the federal government. Where do you want your problem solved? By unelected bureaucrats or local representatives you can actually see and hear? The framers knew that centralizing too much power in Washington was never sustainable. Local self-governance is because it allows for differing preferences and needs across a diverse country. It's a safety valve for frustration and disagreement. And federalism follows directly from the cultural attributes of personal responsibility and liberty that I've been harping on. When we value individual liberty as a cultural foundation, we create a sustainable society. We celebrate the power of the individual because we figured out a long time ago that in order for a diverse people to live together in a complex society, we must empower that individual, not divide people into tribal groups, and not bend the rights of the individual to serve the collective. Our country is a miracle of freedom and prosperity precisely because of these principles, where individuals can work and live in peace without fear of an overwhelming government telling us how to work, how to spend our money, how to run our businesses, or worse, what we can think or say. And it's up to conservatives to remind Americans that our country is a compilation of the best ideas that mankind ever had. What are those ideas? Well, Jerusalem taught us about the purposeful moral existence under God. Athens brought us philosophical and political self-awareness, brought us the gift of reason. Rome taught us the importance of laws and respect for founding virtues. And London taught us that all men are subject to law, even kings, and that checks and balances are paramount to liberty. Those lessons of Jerusalem and Rome and Athens and London were encapsulated in Philadelphia by the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, where we wrote down our unalienable rights and said that the government's purpose was simply to protect those rights, not change them. We are patriots. We believe that the ideals that our country were founded on are the right ones. That doesn't make us perfect. We don't always live up to those values. Abraham Lincoln knew that. But progressives do not see America as good. Now, according to them, when we aren't perfect, the only course of action is to undermine the very values and ideals that America was built on, to tear up our history and instead look to secular socialism as the answer. Well, secular socialism is not America. The American character is simple. We believe in liberty and the freedom to live our lives and pursue our happiness and live the American dream. We believe in a pluribus unum, that we are united under one flag and our mission should be to protect that flag and the ideals it represents. And we believe in the statement, "In God we trust," because we know where our virtue and our morality comes from, and we know that we cannot live in a free society without God's moral foundations. That's why we gathered here tonight. Because if we don't come together, if we don't define our own principles and remind the world why they matter and why they are correct, we lose the spirit of the American experiment. We gather here because we aren't about to let that happen. America is the greatest idea that mankind ever had, and we aren't about to let it be squandered. So God bless you, and thank you for having me.